Ladies and gentlemen, as this day folds into the quiet of night, we turn our hearts toward God, releasing every burden, every unanswered question, every silent tear. Let the noise of the day lose its authority, and let divine peace take its place. May anxiety dissolve, may fear lose its grip, and may the presence of God saturate this room. We declare rest for the mind, calm for the heart, and strength for the soul, as heaven settles gently over us, filling this atmosphere with assurance, hope, and unexplainable peace that guards us through the night. As the day comes to its close, there is a sacred invitation to lay down every weight that has followed you from morning until now, to consciously and deliberately release the burdens of the day into God's hands, understanding that nothing you carried was ever meant to destroy you. Every pressure, every disappointment, every conversation that unsettled your spirit, every expectation that was not met, every delay that tried to frustrate your faith can be surrendered in this moment. This is not an act of weakness. It is an expression of trust, recognizing that human strength has limits, but divine grace does not. When you release the burdens of the day, you are declaring that God is more invested in your peace than your worries ever were, and that His wisdom surpasses your need to control outcomes. The mind often replays moments that cannot be changed, but prayer redirects the heart to the one who redeems time and restores strength. In this release, you are not ignoring reality. You are transferring responsibility from your fragile hands to the eternal hands that uphold all things. The heart finds rest when it stops arguing with the day and begins to agree with God. Every fear that whispered during quiet moments, every concern about tomorrow, every hidden anxiety about provision, health, family, purpose, and direction can be consciously handed over, knowing that God is not overwhelmed by details. Releasing burdens is an act of alignment where your soul comes back into order under divine authority. The night becomes lighter when the heart is no longer heavy. God never asked you to carry what only He can sustain. The spiritual discipline of release trains the soul to depend on grace instead of striving. In letting go, you are not losing control. You are gaining peace. The day may have demanded explanations, performance, and resilience, but the night invites surrender and trust. When burdens are released, the atmosphere changes. The body responds. The mind slows, and the spirit becomes sensitive again. There is healing in the act of surrender, because what you place in God's hands is no longer fighting for space in your heart. Each released burden becomes a testimony of faith, a quiet declaration that God remains faithful even when answers are delayed. The soul was designed to rest in God, not to compete with Him. As you release the day, you allow God to work beyond your awareness, to handle matters while you sleep, to reorder situations without your anxiety interfering. This release is also an act of humility, acknowledging that you are not self-sufficient and that dependence on God is not a last option, but a lifestyle. Peace flows naturally where surrender is practiced sincerely. The burdens of the day lose their power when they are named and surrendered in prayer. God does not demand polished words. He responds to honest hearts. The moment you let go, you create room for divine peace to settle, for strength to be renewed, for hope to rise quietly. Releasing burdens is not a one-time event. It is a daily rhythm, a sacred exchange where weariness is replaced with rest. The night becomes a sanctuary when the soul refuses to carry unresolved weight. In surrender, you are choosing life over anxiety, faith over fear, rest over restlessness, and trust over control, allowing your spirit to breathe freely again under the covering of divine care and assurance that God remains at work even now while you rest in Him and release everything completely into His hands. There is a spiritual law that atmospheres respond to spiritual invitations. And when divine peace is invited, it does not arrive as an idea, but as a presence that settles gently yet firmly within a space. Peace is not merely the absence of noise or trouble. It is the active rule of God's presence over an environment, bringing alignment to everything within it. When divine peace fills a room, it touches the mind, calms the emotions, steadies the heart, and quiets inner storms that words cannot explain. This peace does not wait for circumstances to improve. It enters rooms where situations are unresolved, where questions remain unanswered, where the future feels uncertain. Inviting divine peace is an intentional act of faith, a declaration that God's presence is more real than the tension that may be felt. The room becomes more than walls and furniture. It becomes an altar where God's rest is established. Peace carries authority. It silences confusion, restrains fear, and restores order to scattered thoughts. When peace fills a room, even the body responds, breathing slows, muscles relax, and the soul begins to remember what rest feels like. This peace is not produced by human effort. It is received through surrender and expectation. The moment peace is welcomed, heaviness loses its right to remain. Divine peace does not shout, it settles. It does not rush, it abides. It brings with it assurance that God is near, involved, and attentive. A room filled with divine peace becomes a place of safety, where the heart can be honest and the spirit can breathe without pressure. Peace guards the mind against replaying the failures of the day and protects the heart from imagining worst-case scenarios. It creates an atmosphere where trust grows naturally and fear finds no reinforcement. When peace fills a room, spiritual sensitivity increases and the soul becomes more aware of God's nearness. This peace does not deny reality. It redefines it through the lens of faith. The room may be small, but the peace is vast. The night may be quiet, but the peace is alive. Inviting peace is also an acknowledgement that God desires rest for his people, not constant striving. Peace settles where control is released and where dependence on God is welcomed. The atmosphere shifts when peace is present. Conversations become gentle, thoughts become ordered, and emotions become balanced. Divine peace has the ability to sanctify space, turning ordinary rooms into places of divine encounter. It brings clarity without pressure and confidence without arrogance. Peace reminds the soul that God is faithful even when outcomes are unknown. When peace fills a room, it stands as a witness that God's presence has the final word. This peace is strong enough to remain through the night, guarding sleep, protecting dreams, and restoring strength quietly. It stands watch over the heart, refusing entry to anxiety and fear. Inviting divine peace is not a ritual. It is a relationship response, flowing from trust in God's character. Peace thrives where God is acknowledged and honored. The room becomes lighter, not because problems vanished, but because God's presence outweighs them. Divine peace brings balance between hope and patience, between expectation and rest. It reassures the soul that tomorrow is held by the same God who sustained today. Peace fills gaps that logic cannot explain. It settles questions that answers have not yet addressed. When peace is invited, it occupies the room fully, leaving no corner for dread or unrest. It remains steady, constant, and faithful, reminding the heart that God is present, attentive, and actively involved even now as his peace continues to rest, rule, and saturate every part of this space and every layer of the soul in quiet assurance. Anxiety and fear gain strength when they are left unchallenged, when they are allowed to speak repeatedly to the mind without resistance, shaping perceptions and influencing emotions silently. Prayer becomes the spiritual authority that confronts these voices and strips them of power. When anxiety rises, it is often because the heart is trying to predict outcomes without divine insight. And fear thrives where trust has been weakened by uncertainty. Through prayer, the soul repositions itself under the governance of God, refusing to submit to imagined threats and internal unrest. Prayer does not deny the existence of challenges. It denies them the right to rule the heart. Anxiety speaks in urgency. Fear speaks in exaggeration. But prayer speaks in alignment with truth. The moment prayer is engaged, fear is exposed for what it is, a signal that the heart has momentarily shifted focus from God's sovereignty to human limitation. Prayer restores perspective, reminding the soul that God remains present, powerful, and attentive. As prayer rises, anxiety begins to lose its grip because the heart is no longer isolated with its thoughts. Fear feeds on isolation, but prayer reconnects the soul to divine assurance. In prayer, the mind is trained to submit restless thoughts to higher authority. The heart learns to pause instead of panic. Fear loses its momentum when it is brought into the presence of God. Prayer does not always change circumstances instantly, but it changes the atmosphere within, and that internal shift weakens anxiety significantly. Anxiety often exaggerates tomorrow, but prayer anchors the soul in the faithfulness of God today. Fear thrives on uncertainty, but prayer invites trust into the unknown. Through prayer, the soul declares that God's word carries more weight than emotional turbulence. Prayer interrupts the cycle of overthinking by redirecting attention toward divine truth. As prayer continues, the nervous energy that fuels anxiety begins to settle. The heart starts to feel guarded, protected, and reassured. Fear loses its authority when the soul acknowledges that God is greater than every imagined outcome. Prayer becomes a shield, not by human strength, but by divine presence. The act of praying itself is a declaration of dependence, and dependence on God dismantles fear at its root. Anxiety often comes from the need to control, but prayer releases control and restores peace. When the heart prays, it is reminded that God does not sleep, does not forget, and does not abandon his own. Fear weakens when the soul consistently returns to prayer instead of replaying worst-case scenarios. Prayer silences anxiety by replacing noise with presence. It brings calm, not by explanation, but by assurance. As prayer deepens, the heart becomes less reactive and more grounded. Fear may attempt to return, but prayer reinforces spiritual boundaries that protect the mind. The soul learns that peace is not fragile when it is anchored in God. Prayer teaches the heart to breathe again, to rest again, to trust again. Anxiety loses its grip when prayer becomes the first response rather than the last resort. Fear retreats when prayer establishes God's authority over thoughts and emotions. Through prayer, the soul gains confidence that it is not alone in the battle of the mind. God's presence fills the gaps where fear once dominated. Prayer invites light into places anxiety tried to darken. It reminds the heart that God's promises are not threatened by present uncertainty. Fear may whisper, but prayer speaks louder. Anxiety may knock, but prayer decides who is allowed to enter. In prayer, the soul is trained to wait instead of worry, to trust instead of tremble, to believe instead of fear. The repeated act of prayer builds spiritual resilience, strengthening the heart against future waves of anxiety. Fear cannot coexist comfortably with sustained prayer because prayer introduces truth, peace, and divine order. The heart becomes guarded, the mind becomes disciplined, and the spirit becomes steady as prayer continues to silence anxiety and fear, establishing a calm confidence rooted in the unchanging nature of God and the assurance of His constant presence within the soul and over every unseen concern. Rest is not merely a physical act. It is a spiritual posture where the soul consciously leans into the faithfulness of God, trusting Him to guard what the mind can no longer manage. When the day ends and activity slows, there is an invitation to settle into God's presence, not as an escape from responsibility, but as an expression of confidence in His care. Resting in God's presence means allowing His nearness to become the final awareness before sleep, letting go of the urge to replay conversations, decisions, and unfinished tasks. In His presence, the heart learns that it does not need to stay alert through anxiety in order to be safe. God's presence becomes a covering that watches over the soul when human vigilance fades. As the heart rests, God stands guard, protecting the mind from intrusive thoughts and the spirit from unrest. This kind of rest is an act of trust, a declaration that God remains active even when you are not. The night is not a vulnerable time. When God is present, it becomes a season of divine supervision. Resting in God's presence aligns the soul with peace, allowing the body to recover and the mind to be renewed. It acknowledges that God designed rest as part of faith, not as an interruption to productivity. In His presence, rest becomes restorative rather than restless. The guarding of the night is not maintained by human effort, but by divine faithfulness. God's presence reassures the heart that nothing is slipping out of control while you sleep. As rest deepens, the soul releases the pressure to understand everything. God's presence fills the silence with assurance rather than uncertainty. The heart finds safety in knowing that God is nearer than fear, stronger than worry, and more attentive than anxiety. Resting in God's presence trains the soul to trust beyond daylight faith, extending dependence into the quiet hours. The mind learns to slow down, thoughts become gentle, and emotions settle under divine authority. God's presence becomes a boundary that fear cannot cross. Through rest, the soul experiences the reality that peace is not fragile when God is involved. Resting in His presence also prepares the heart for tomorrow, not through planning, but through strengthening. God guards the night by guarding the inner life, stabilizing emotions, and renewing strength unseen. The night becomes a sacred space where God ministers quietly, healing what the day strained and restoring what the day depleted. Rest is no longer passive. It becomes participation in God's care. As the soul rests, God walks. He guards dreams, protects thoughts, and restores balance within the heart. Resting in God's presence acknowledges that security comes from relationship, not awareness. The soul does not need to stay awake to remain protected. God's presence remains constant, unwavering, and attentive. In this rest, the heart is freed from the fear of missing something or losing control. God's presence assures the soul that He is fully capable of managing what lies ahead. The guarding of the night is an expression of God's covenant faithfulness, not dependent on human perfection. As rest continues, the heart becomes more sensitive to peace and less responsive to disturbance. God's presence becomes familiar, comforting, and steady. The soul learns that rest is not absence of faith, but evidence of it. The night is embraced not with caution, but with confidence. Resting in God's presence allows peace to deepen trust, to mature, and faith to remain active even in stillness as the soul remains covered, protected and secure under the watchful care of a God who neither slumbers nor sleeps, faithfully guarding every moment of the night and every hidden concern within the heart.